Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures. I'm excited about today's episode with Valerie Groth. She's doing some amazing work in the south side of Chicago. And so we talk about a variety of different things, including the school that she's spinning up, her past in social work and her work in schools. And there are a lot of insights that we discuss in today's episode. So first, a couple words from sponsors that make this show possible. In full disclosure, I am an operator investor in these companies. Number one, Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll see and be able to participate in operational frameworks that will guide you through the process of building lots of different types of startups. So depending on your unique business model and market vertical, you'll be able to receive customized coaching so that you and your team and your advisors and investors can be on the same page with regard to your roadmap. Number two, Satchel. If you go to satchel.works, it is a simplified newsletter and publishing platform that I use. You can go there and see an example of my own Satchel site where I'm able to write about lots of different things. And if you're interested in subscribing, you can actually subscribe to any particular topic that I write about. You may be really interested in Web3 and blockchains, but not necessarily as interested when I write about something like the Enneagram. And it allows authors and creators to be able to freely publish what they want to publish. So it allows their audience to subscribe to what they're interested in. So for today's episode, if you are listening, you can also watch by visiting wclittle.com. And there you'll see more extensive show notes to the things that we talk about today. And if you're watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this episode with Valerie Groth. All right, Val, welcome to the show.
Thanks, great to be here.
Really great to have you. I was so inspired by your book and your story and your journey and just the way that you have taken your skills as a social worker and have turned that into a very admirable entrepreneurial pursuit here. So I'm excited for this conversation. So why don't we start? If you want to just tell us a little bit about your background, where you're from, how did you get into the realm that you work in now?
Different ways to start that story. I would say, I won't give you like my childhood story, but I was always an entrepreneur deep down, and I just didn't know what that looked like. I think of being a kid, all I wanted to do was talk about ideas and inventions, and I was a little kid, so they were probably ideas with a lot of merit, but that was just all I wanted to do. My dad and I, we had this idea called icy inserts, for when you're really hot and it's summer, have an insert that you put in your shoe that cools down or heats up so that you can stay cold. We just got so fired up, and we'd kind of have mini business plans, and that was all I thought about. But then back then, I was born in '83, and so I went to college in the early 2000 era. They didn't have entrepreneurship classes, let alone social entrepreneurship classes. And so I just think about the fact that I literally didn't take that path because I didn't know what it looked like. The idea of you can't be what you can't see. And I just didn't know anyone. My parents' friends were all other, pretty typical 9-to-5 professionals who worked at a university or worked as a dentist. I just didn't know anyone who was an entrepreneur. And so I didn't know what to do. I explored other pathways. Studied psychology, really enjoyed it, then studied social work in grad school. And I fell into working as a school social worker. So kind of the opposite of an entrepreneur in some ways. And I was really happy in the work. I loved working with these great kids. I worked in Chicago public schools, working with these fantastic students who were just facing a whole host of issues outside school. So trauma, living in poverty, exposure to violence, really, really tough issues that no child should have to deal with. And it was not a couple kids in my school. It was pretty much kind of the norm in so many of those schools through no fault of these children or their families, but just, the levels of systemic inequalities that we know are out there. And so I got really frustrated seeing these great kids falling through the cracks. And that was kind of when the entrepreneur piece came back in. And I thought, there's got to be a better way. And had some ideas for how to create a more holistic model focused on kids who need trauma informed practices, but also had the idea like, what if we built a boarding school so these kids who don't have homes can have a safe, stable environment? And I researched and found that other schools had or in existence in other cities, and not Chicago, even though we have a tremendous need here in Chicago. So all that to say, like I had the idea for what I'm doing now about 13 years ago, but I sat on it for about 7 years, really just because I didn't know what to do. I didn't know the pathway. And I got really stuck on like, what is that next how-to step? And so there was a long time where I put the idea aside, not because I didn't want to do it, but I was just so fearful and I didn't think I had the tools and that technical knowledge to do so. If that makes sense.
So backing up, for those who aren't familiar, what is social work? Like, what do you learn in school? Right? I think a lot of people are just unfamiliar because it's often not talked about very much. So I think it'd be cool just to hear a little bit more about kind of why you got into it, what it is, what sort of things you learned, and just to sort of educate the audience here a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I feel like I'm going to do a terrible disservice to social workers because I couldn't quote like what is that definition, right, of a social worker. The cool thing about social work, I will say, so I started in psychology and then went to social work for one of my graduate degrees. And I loved social work because in psychology, you're often working with people and kind of the study of why people behave the way that they do, but it's a kind of narrow pathway in that way. Versus social work is really very versatile and there are so many different things you can do. So some social workers work as therapists and they have their own private practice or provide actual therapy in different settings. But there's also social work advocacy and kind of working on the policy side. And within all those settings or within all those disciplines, you can work in different settings. So there's hospital social workers and social workers in the prison system. I think if I had to sum up kind of, oh gosh, it is tough. I mean, social work is really about one of the mottos we use is meeting your client where they are, and so just trying to really be strength based and focused on what is the individual need and thinking about how are the systems around them helping them or hurting them. And again, so often it's clients having challenges through no fault of their own, but living in this really challenged society where we have a lot of inequities and providing different resources to help them to get to where they want to be.
Yeah.
That's probably a terrible answer, but
no, I mean, I think that's a really good summary. And then in school, then do you take different tracks? If you're getting an MSW, for example, Master of Social Work, for those that aren't familiar with the acronyms, in this industry, we throw around acronyms like crazy. So it's good to define them. For those that aren't familiar, so then do you take like a track through it, or are MSWs pretty standardized across the board, or what's that like?
So that's a great question. There are opportunities to do different tracks. I took one to be a school social worker. You have to spend a whole year in that setting and get an internship. And pass separate certification exams to be a school social worker, for example. Otherwise, there are different disciplines. So my university specialized in international social work, and so that was one of their focus areas. There are some that are focused on clinical social work, where you are acting more of that therapist versus a liaison, for example. But it really is a very cool opportunity, I think, just to make a big difference. But again, like that versatility, I think is really exciting. So I always encourage anyone who's looking into any of the helping professions, like counselor, social worker, psychologist, definitely I say the MSOU is the way to go because you can do so much with it. And we know people are job hopping all the time these days, and you don't have to be locked into one pathway. There are so many cool opportunities. And the MSW is also a really well respected degree as well. It usually pays better and is kind of more coveted than an LCSW, for example. I'm not LCSW, LCPC, which is the counseling perspective.
Got it. So then for you personally, why South Chicago? What was it after you do your schooling and you're diving in? Why there?
You asked about the track, and I took the school social work track not because I wanted to, but because you have to have that. And the advice I was given was, if you think you ever want to do it now. You're never going to want to quit your job and go do an unpaid internship for a year. So I thought I wanted to go into gerontology and to work with the elderly. That was actually just totally different population, or I guess the opposite population. But I fell in love with school social work. I just really enjoyed the opportunity to work with my kids and their families. And I think in terms of why that population has been where I've spent so much of my time, I think a lot of it comes down to my parents were in the Peace Corps before I was born. And that was just kind of really imprinted upon me that, again, like, this is not an equal world that we live in, and that I was lucky to have, I was very middle class, but access to great opportunities and resources because of, the fact that we were middle class, that I had a great school to go to, the fact that I'm white and I have privileges that a lot of people don't have. And it was always kind of just the messaging that I got from my family that it's our place to be able to give back, and not even to give back. I kind of dislike that term. It should be almost like giving forward. I think it's not like you're giving back, like people need you, or you're helping someone who is a victim of their circumstances, but just that it's something all humans should be doing, I think, in that way. And so it just made sense. This is a population that is too often neglected and does not have equal access to opportunities and resources simply because of the systemic challenges.
So for those who haven't read your first book, is it your first book, I'm assuming? What was the work? So you dove in and started working in the schools. What was the kind of work that you were doing kind of day in and day out there?
Yeah, it depends on the on paper answer. I had kids I was supposed to be seeing on a regular basis, and they had a set, kind of plan in front of them. And it was often typical middle school issues, for example, and I primarily worked in K through 8 schools. So I did some high school, but this is mostly younger kids. So mostly like, hey, Joey needs some help with social skills, bullying, things like that. I didn't barely any of that. So I barely saw the kids who were on my caseload, is what they call that. Most of my time was spent acting as a crisis counselor, a grief counselor, kids who, lost someone overnight and came to school the next day and needed support. Students who witnessed homicide the night before and came to school the next day. A lot of my students who were actually dealing with self-harm and suicidal ideation. That was one of the biggest parts of my job, was helping kids to get treatment, and in severe cases that would mean going to a psych hospital because they weren't safe to go home to their family. And that actually was a huge part of kind of what led me to do the work that I'm doing now, was the kids who were suicidal, because they often fell into a couple of different camps. There were students who just really didn't see a way out. And one of the stories I do tell in the book that I still think of to this day, they worked with these amazing girls, 2 sisters, who were crazy bright, Ivy League kind of, could have been Ivy League bound kids. And they were in and out of the hospital about every couple weeks or so. And it was because there was so much happening at home, a lot of abuse, physical abuse, mental, verbal abuse, sexual abuse by family, by, paramours of the family. And one day the father said to one of the girls, just effing kill yourself next time. And in that moment, I realized, these bright girls are likely not going to make it because this is what they're going home to, right? And I also, in sharing that, abuse and neglect happen, and it happens in Chicago. We have a high number of reported cases in Illinois. It's a very real thing. I also just want to kind of put an asterisk next to that too. I also don't want to imply that, the work that we're doing is because parents are at fault too, because again, these are families who are really struggling because they haven't had the same access and opportunities that most of us have had growing up. And I worked with a ton of families who were just phenomenal, but students who still had that trauma exposure, right? So I just want to make sure, and sharing those stories, not at all putting the blame on these families. But I also saw kids who were acting out with the suicidal ideation, not because they were kind of truly inherently suicidal, but because they knew going to the hospital, what did that mean? It meant shelter, it meant warmth, it meant 3 meals a day, it meant stability. And for kids who didn't feel safe going to a homeless shelter or didn't even have that opportunity, that meant, that stability that they were looking for. And that was such a red flag for me, that these kids, and again, like not talking high school kids, we're talking 10-year-olds sometimes, would have to think through, well, this is what I have to do to go somewhere safe. And to extrapolate on that, we know that's also true for the justice system, right? For kids and also for adults, that a lot of people who are incarcerated, that is a safe place where they know they are taken care of, and decisions get made to get there for that reason, which is highly wrong, terrible. I mean, that we have to be in that position.
Right. So then what started the kernel of your idea to start a new form of school that I'll let you explain to the audience here?
Yeah.
But where did the idea originally come from?
It started early stages. I mentioned kind of from day one, I thought this is just what needs to happen, because I was working with these great kids who were full potential, but were looking for more of that support, and families were asking, do you have a more supportive environment? Kids were asking for that. But, again, I did the research, realized this is kind of crazy. It's going to cost a lot of money. I don't know what to do. I don't know where to start. Am I the person to do it? So I kind of sat on the idea for quite a few years. And then in 2012, one of the things that was kind of a focal point in this journey is one of the students I worked very closely with was shot and killed. He was 12 years old. He was playing in front of his house with his younger brother, and he was gunned down. And I had lost kids before, but I worked really closely with this child named Ryan. He was just extraordinary. And that was a little bit of a turning point for me. The realization of, I had the idea years ago, this is still happening. It's going to keep happening. But I will say, in terms of when I actually decided to do it, it wasn't in that moment. That was definitely a turning point. About a year after Ryan was killed, I believe, I went to a conference actually in Portland. Have you heard of the World Domination Summit?
I haven't, no.
It's a crazy idea, or a crazy name, I should say. Really cool conference. I think they're sunsetting it this year. But the idea is focused around how to live a remarkable life in an unconventional world. And so it was attended by a ton of entrepreneurs and creators and artists, and really cool venue. And so I went to my first time attending this conference, and this author named Michael Hyatt took the stage. And Michael said, I talked to an actuary before this event and did the math, and out of the audience of all of you, which is I think about 1,000 of us, he said, one of you is going to die in 30 days. And so that hit me really hard. And I think on paper, you would think like, oh, life is short. Like that was her reaction. Like, life is short. I should do this. Like, I don't want to die with regret. But that wasn't what did it. I had this realization in that moment of, I've been holding myself back because I don't know what the next step is. I don't know what the how is. I don't have this blueprint in front of me. And that was terrifying. But for some reason, it clicked for me that nobody has a blueprint. And I had this thought of like, well, what would Oprah do? She'd be in the exact same position as me, a little more money, but she wouldn't know what is that next step and what that pathway looks like. If Oprah had an idea, as she did, of course, with her boarding school in Africa, all she could do is find the people who could help her get there and bring together great minds and ideas, and she'd figure it out. So that idea 100% is what changed everything for me, because it kind of even the playing field. Like if Oprah doesn't know what to do, like me and Oprah are on the same page, like I should just get over this hurdle of the not knowing. So that was a long answer, but that moment was really what did it. I think if I hadn't had that moment, I would have been stuck in the fear piece for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful story. The entrepreneurs listening in, we're often noodling on an idea, and one of the first pieces of validation that an idea is probably something that you should do is that you can't stop thinking about it.
Yes.
And that what you're basically deciding to invest in your idea with your time, with your brain power, often sometimes against your will, because it's just constantly in your head. So then you're working in the schools, you have this idea that you've had for quite some time. What steps then do you start taking to actually start getting to a place where it starts to become reality? Very, very curious about that particular phase of the journey.
Yeah, because even that conference was still not the moment I quit. I think it was another year later of me just knowing I was going to quit and preparing for it. And of course, I wish I would have had the guts to start earlier, but I do think it's important to hear that part of the story, because this has definitely not been an easy road, but I'm proud of what we've created. And people think this, I just don't think I realize people understand, like, it was a 13-year process to get here, right? Not that we have, reached the pinnacle of where we want to be, but I think it's important to justify that uncertainty. And just a sidebar, I think like imposter syndrome is something that so many people struggle with in different ways, certainly entrepreneurship. And I once heard Madeleine Albright speak in person, and she said that she still has imposter syndrome. And when I first heard that, I thought, well, shit, if she still has that, right, what hope is there for the rest of us? And women are notorious for that, I think, more so than men, but I know it's an equal opportunity challenge we all have. But then I realized, no, there's so much power in knowing that she has that, because look what she's done despite that. Because I think it's so easy to face or feel that fear and feel the doubt and feel the uncertainty and think there is something valid there that we should listen to. And I just use that analogy because I think if there's anything in my story, I think it's that. And I think it's important to normalize everyone has that doubt, and that doubt is not a reason you shouldn't do it, right? You still need to take that courageous action despite that. It's like the whole, like, confidence is a result, not a requirement.
Yeah. Madeleine Albright, by the way, I listened to a long podcast with her recently. Share what she's had to deal with over the decades and how she's been able to persevere through all of that is quite remarkable, and certainly a lesson for all of us. So
yeah, I don't know if I fully answered your question. I was sorry to sidebar, but when I did quit, I quit with really no plan, which is not always advisable. But I was doing some coaching, and so kind of my actually what I told people initially was that I was leaving to do coaching full time, which was not true. I loved that work, but that was kind of my cover for I actually want to build a school.
Right.
So I spent the first few years just really doing a lot of research. And again, if I had known what I know now, that could have been expedited for sure. But I didn't have that information. And so I just talked to a ton of people and visited schools, talked to as many experts as I could. And I always think about like, what are the different things that I wish I would have known then? And I didn't have a network back then. I left my job and all I knew were other teachers and people from schools. And I really had to learn the power of just having conversations and, getting out there. And so that was what I did the first few years, was just had truly hundreds and probably 1,000 conversations with different people every year. And that, I think, is something I wish I would have known to start earlier. I think it's impossible to do this kind of work, no matter what entrepreneurship kind of work you're doing, without having a network, not just for like the strategic reasons you think of, but just also for support and to have people to call on. That's you have to have those people. I don't think it can be done as a solo mission.
Right. So for those who've come listen thus far and are still not actually sure what Ryan Banks Academy is, do you want to just share sort of holistically what the idea is, where you are at in the stage of that journey, and kind of what your kind of plans are for this immediate year here?
Yeah, so Ryan Banks Academy, I mentioned, is named after, I did mention it. I mentioned the student that was lost to gun violence. Our school is named after him. And we are a fairly new school. We're in the middle of our third year now. We are different in that we focus the entire school on kind of that social work principle of meeting our kids where they're at, and providing trauma-informed care practices, focusing on their mental health and their social emotional learning. And so we're doing some really cool things right now as a school in this kind of day school environment that we're currently operating in. But also what makes us unique is we are working to become a 24/7 holistic boarding school. So the idea is students can stay there, have the great educational experience, but also that wraparound environment as well. And I think that serves a few different kind of or checks a few different boxes. And that I mentioned, we have thousands of kids here in Chicago who have faced homelessness over the course of the year. And so for those students, having stability is so crucial, and having basic needs met first and foremost. But also I started to research, the boarding school model is kind of new in the Midwest where I am, but on the East Coast, it's been happening for 100 odd years, right? Because families that have privilege and access and resources often make that opportunity or choose that opportunity because there's so much learning that happens in that totally immersive 24/7 environment.
Yeah.
And when you break down how much more time you have with kids, it's about 400% more time. So when you're thinking about kids who are coming in behind where they should be, again, not because of the child's fault, but because of their environment, their schooling, you can do so much great learning in that environment. So we're excited to build towards that.
Yeah, that's incredible. So to be able to have a boarding school in the city that students are able to have that 24/7 time to get into an environment where they can flourish, they can learn, that is an absolutely incredible vision. So in starting a nonprofit, assuming it's a nonprofit,
Yep.
that is a undertaking in and of itself. Like how have you gone about the process of fundraising, rallying a team, establishing a board? I'm just, for those that have to are currently going down similar journeys, how have you been architecting that, and how's that going?
Yeah. Well, again, I mean, I had no clue what the hell I was doing when I got started. So many learning lessons along the way. I didn't know we needed to have a board at first. Someone had to tell me that. I was like, what's a board? We had to get a 501c3, which is, like an LLC would be for a corporation. That's what you have to do for your nonprofit. So we were lucky, though. I found a lot of great resources to support us. Like we found a firm to do pro bono legal support. And that's where that networking really comes in handy. We now, where we are a few years later, we've gotten well over $1 million in in-kind support. We have a firm that gives us full service marketing support. We've worked with pro bono architects and lobbyists, and that's really helpful. And I think what I'm doing is, of course, a little different than a for-profit entrepreneur listening, but I think for those who are doing that social impact work, it's a lot easier, I think, to have people really just want to be a part of what you're doing and that mission when there is that give back piece to it, or give forward, I guess. So I think we've been lucky. It's been a ton of grunt work and time put into those relationships, but it wasn't hard because we're doing something meaningful that people wanted to be a part of. And I've really learned that, you don't want to ever underestimate how much people want to help and give back. And that's helped me on the fundraising side too. I think if anyone is listening who's in that boat, is I had to learn, you're not taking something by asking for a donation. You're getting something, but you're not taking because the person giving something to the organization, whether their time or their resources financially, is usually looking for something out of that, and they're getting something from that experience. And so many of our donors have said to me, for example, like, this is one of the best things that our family does, is giving back to Ryan Banks, because we've been looking for a way to make an impact, and we love being a part of your school. And he realized there's that give and take. And so I really want to underscore the fact that people are out there and they want to help you. And I think that's definitely the case for-profit as well. And just that, again, I've taken thousands of meetings, and I can count on one hand how many people said no. And the people who said no were never the ones you'd expect to. I mean, we've met with the Secretary of Education, Arnie Duncan, is a supporter. He's someone who was a role model for me for many years. He's now someone, we can call on to seek his advice. We've had the comedian Jeff Garland host events for us with Jack Black and Sarah Silverman. We've done so many things that I think people would think, well, how do you get those people? It's really not as hard and as scary as it seems, especially when you do have a cause that people want to get behind. But so many people just don't want to ask and are scared to ask. And you've just got to get out there, and people want to be a part of it.
Yeah. So then you're a few years in here, what has life been like during the pandemic? I mean, I'd imagine, and I've heard just tons of stories about the inner cities and life in there. What is it like for you and your students and the school during this past season here?
Yeah. Thanks for asking. Oh boy, it's been a crazy year. I think there have been definitely some ups and downs. I mean, from a fundraising perspective, it has been tough. We had some funding that we lost because those foundations lost their funding. So that's been challenging. We've been putting a lot of our time into trying to get state funding. I've been going to Springfield and lobbying, and have really enjoyed that process and the chance to meet with legislators. And we were making some really tremendous headway, and the pandemic hit and kind of exploded the whole process. There was no session down in Springfield in May, and then no session again in November. So everything was on pause. So it's been really, really challenging from a fundraising perspective. I would say, I think the biggest challenge, really even beyond that, is just how it's impacting our families. So many of our kids who their families have lost jobs, lost loved ones, lost homes. That's been really, really challenging just on our kids. And I think we're remote right now. Attending school remotely is a lot to ask of a child. So many of our kids don't have parents at home because they're at work during the day. And so they're having to self-manage and do things that so many adults aren't good at. And they're doing it. It's amazing. I think on the plus side, it's been interesting getting to use technology in different ways. For example, we just put together a really great mentor program, and a lot of our mentors are people who don't live in Chicago. Most of them are, but even those who are in Chicago, some of these are people who couldn't leave their office to drive down to our school once a week, but now they can do that, during the workday efficiently. We've hosted a virtual event and had a really amazing turnout because grandparents could come who otherwise couldn't get to the venue. People who are living in Florida can show up. So it's been definitely kind of challenge. I mean, it's horrible. It's been kind of a horrible year in a lot of ways, for sure, as a nonprofit. But it's been great, kind of seeing some silver linings in all of that. I think we also kind of, especially after this summer and the fallout from the death of George Floyd, we saw a lot of donors coming out of the woodwork too, who wanted to get more involved. So that was also, and it would have been great to see that showing a year ago or 20 years ago, right?
Sure,
but
sure.
it's helpful that people are starting to do it now. I'm not going to complain.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So then the grind of just running and spearheading an organization, right? As executive director, leading teams, rallying, fundraising. There's a lot of commonalities between for-profit and nonprofit entrepreneurship. What kind of lessons are you learning in this season in terms of just entrepreneurship in general, given your particular context?
In this season, in terms of COVID and the effects of the pandemic?
Yeah.
I think, well, yeah, so many things. Aside from, the obvious like attributes like resiliency and whatnot, I think it definitely comes down to we've had to learn how to pivot on a dime. Our staff is giving this great education to our kids from their homes, and it's not ideal. We love to be in the classroom, but it's working. But also we're thinking through all those questions too around, if we aren't able to continue getting public funding or seeking public funding as we were going to do, what are the other alternatives that we can do? And in some ways, potentially, shifting the long-term mission in different ways, looking at fundraising in different ways, just being really creative. So I think just that adaptability has been helpful.
Yeah, that's such an important part of just being an entrepreneur, is that adaptability, the ability to listen, the ability to execute on those types of pivots. So in terms of basically so your vantage point, given your history and professional work and entrepreneurship here more recently, you've seen a lot, and your perspective in terms of what is going on in the inner city, Chicago being, I think, an important kind of archetype of West inner cities in the Western world. For the entrepreneurs listening in, the social entrepreneurship has become is ramping up significantly. People want to figure out a way, either on a for-profit or a nonprofit context, to really help out social problems that are out there. What problems do you see that I think that are still really significant, that you feel like entrepreneurs should be seriously considered going after?
I mean, there are so many big societal issues, I think, around just racial injustice, and that's applicable across every single sector, not just education, healthcare, the criminal justice system, corporate America. I think that's such an important area to be focusing on. We're just so far behind, and so much damage has been done. And it really feels like this is the year where people are starting to understand there's inequalities existing right now, and that awareness is just a very, very, very beginning step. I think, and gosh, again, there's so many, this is such a loaded question, and there are a lot of exciting opportunities out there, I think. But people ask what to do and how they can help. And I think a lot of it really is voting with your dollars and using your choices to make an impact. I think there are ways of giving platforms to, Black voices, and that's not just in this social sector or nonprofits, but in the for-profit world too. I don't have the stats, and maybe you do, but I know, Black entrepreneurs have the, least likelihood of getting venture capital dollars. I know white women, it's also not where it should be, but Black entrepreneurs, it's a very, very small percentage of what a white male would get. So I think there are so many places where just having access and a voice and access to resources is just not there. And that's an opportunity, I think, just in the creation of more of those channels and more of those platforms, to give, individuals of color an opportunity to even get their voices, their product, their services out there.
That's a really good word. I mean, that's a very tangible way, I think, that all of us can be part of a solution to help rise the tide for everybody here. I mean, what are you learning about the conversation around race and racism, given your background in social work and your work in the inner city there? How do you think about the conversation?
Oh gosh. Again, it's such a big question to answer. And I think it's one that I'm continually learning about too. I also feel like it's hard to answer this question because I don't have all of the answers. And, I mean, working in the work that I've done, I've kind of been immersed in that world and seen firsthand what those injustices look like.
Mm.
But I also understand, as a white woman, I really can't, make that comparable reference. And, I'm still in a learning process, I think, around how I can, be the best, advocate and ally, and resource, and to use my platforms, my network, to help. So I think it's a constant learning experience, I think, for all of us. And there's obviously a lot of great books and resources out there, and I'm sure people listening have heard this one before, but I do think the book White Fragility is a great place to start. I don't think anyone should jump into any action before that reading, because I think it really makes you evaluate, like, what are my own implicit biases, and reflecting on your own privilege. And that's a really hard thing, I think, for anyone to do, regardless of how, you might think you're really self-aware, but really, like, putting weight to that. The fact that likely every decision, or I shouldn't say decision, likely every kind of step of our lives has been dictated by the fact that we are white, living in an America that is built for us. What school we attended, what kind of jobs wanted to hire us, our ability to get into college, every single aspect of our lives has really been impacted by that. And I think so many people are, well-meaning white people are still really scared of that idea, and it's faced with a lot of defensiveness and, responses of, well, my family suffered too. Maybe they came from Poland in World War II or what have you. And it's not about saying that suffering didn't happen, but it's, the issue that African Americans have faced in our country is very, very, very. It's a completely different ballgame, and I'm not describing myself well here, but
yeah, that's a good way to say it. I mean, it is a different game. It's like they're playing a different game with different rules.
Yeah, exactly.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. So for Ryan Banks, then, for those that are intrigued, that want to help out, what are the various mechanisms? How can they get a hold of you? What are the different opportunities for people to help out?
Yeah, thanks. And I think, because we're still a fairly new organization, there's so many ways of getting involved. And especially for your audience of entrepreneurs, I always say, like, we are more like a startup than a school in so many ways. And it's what we're doing is so entrepreneurial, which is so exciting. And there's a chance to really leave your fingerprints all over something when it's in the early stages, so this is, I think, a really cool time to get involved. We've done a lot of the legwork and gotten those first couple hard years behind us where we didn't have resources and a team and a school. We have those things now. So we've made the traction, built the momentum, but we're still building. And so it's a great time. Of course, donations are always our big focus for us. So we are always happy to accept donations of any size. That can happen through our website, which is ryanbanksacademy.org. But beyond that, I mean, just as important, we're always looking just to meet great people. We're looking to grow our board of directors, which is kind of our executive board. We have a younger board called the associate board, which is more of a junior board for young professionals. I think it's age 24 or 22 to 30, maybe. The University of Chicago students just launched a Ryan Banks chapter at their school. So now we're going to have a college chapter we're going to be expanding. And then we have a bunch of different ways of volunteering. We have people who want to help with their kids, mentoring or tutoring at the school, teaching a virtual class. And then a lot of things happening behind the scenes with event planning and working on the strategic plan. It's, because we're doing something very kind of comprehensive, everything is touched by it. So, I mean, I say there's truly nothing that we can't use in terms of expertise and guidance. If you're in construction, great. We need that help. Marketing, finance, everything is touched by this work. So there's, if anyone wants to learn more, always happy to have a conversation about how you can help. And my contact is Valerie at ryanbanksacademy.org.
Love it. Love it. So what's your vision? The next 5, 10, 15 years, where do you hope that Ryan Banks Academy is? However you want to answer that, whatever that vision is, I'm curious.
Yeah, well, we would love to have our own building, and we recently, I'm not going to share too much details about it, but we recently found a building that is kind of custom made for our needs. So I just have my sights on this particular building we'd love to move into. It's move-in ready. We wouldn't have to do any construction. And we want to get our kids into that boarding school as soon as we possibly can. So it's hard to say, and you asked what my vision is, not what's realistic. It's hard to say what that timeline is because so many things were influenced by the pandemic. So I hate to speculate when we think that will happen, but definitely in 15 years, we want to have a fully functioning boarding school up and running. And really in 15 years, we'd like to have more than one campus. We think the need is there. People have asked us to have the model in different neighborhoods. We've actually had other cities talk about the idea of that kind of expansion. So in 15 years, hopefully we have more than one campus.
It's great. I love it. It's super, super exciting. So any final words for the entrepreneurs, investors, people in startup ecosystems listening in that are inspired by your story, the way that you've just practically taken action against the thing that's been in your brain for many years? It's super admirable. Any final words?
I mean, again, I think it's really important just to use your words. When you have that thing that you're just obsessed with, you really have to follow that and kind of follow it at all costs. Even when people say you're crazy, people don't understand, they don't think it can be done, and not to let your own doubt and uncertainty get in the way. And I also really just think cold calling is very effective. So that's been so big for us. Because I didn't have a network when I started. And so that's all it was just calling people I didn't know. And my God, that's been effective. I mean, we've gotten, significant funding from top billionaire philanthropists from cold calling. So just never be afraid to get out there and ask for what you want.
That's wonderful. Well, Valerie, really appreciate your time. This has been a super insightful conversation, so I very much appreciate it. Thank you. All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups and health science and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proto Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you in your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it would be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.